Latin. Cicero said, "Unimago est allumini voltis sic indices sulci," which means the face is a picture of the mind and the eyes are its interpreter. As I was thinking about how to start the presentation, I was reminded of the quote, the eyes are the window to the soul. And in doing my research, I thought, where did that come from? And some say that it came from Shakespeare. Others say that it came from the Bible. But I found that the primary source was from Cicero. And so I thought, in this time of COVID, and I promise that I am not going to get political in any way, no reference to the mask that we wear on a daily basis. But I was reminded that when I go to the grocery store often, I'll see someone and I'll think, I think I know them, but I'm not really sure. And I'm sure you've all had that same experience when you go to the store or out and about doing your daily living. Someone might come up to you and say, "Is that you, Nancy?" or "Is that you, Jane?" I didn't really recognize you because you were wearing a mask. And I thought, very interesting comment, because those of us who are out and about with our COVID masks, our eyes and our eyebrows are visible, and it's our nose and our mouth that are covered. Which led me to the question, how are humans most recognized by other human beings? And so I did a little bit of research, and I talked to a person who is a friend of mine, a psychologist, but I also got on and did a little bit of research about facial recognition. And I was very surprised to find that the one facial feature that is most recognizable or allows us to be recognized by one another is not the eyes at all, it's the eyebrows. And I thought, how curious. I would have thought maybe someone's smile was a giveaway to them, but no, it's the eyebrows. And there has been research done where over 100 people, celebrities, sports stars, those in pop culture, had their eyebrows covered. And then in a group questionnaire, the people were asked, who is this person? And when the eyebrows were covered, a great percentage of the people who were taking the survey could not identify the person. At the same time, those same celebrities had their eyes covered, perhaps with, it really didn't say what they were covered with, but the eyes were covered and they were recognized. So I thought, that's very curious that we are recognized by our eyebrows, but I guess with the raising of the eyebrows, along with the other features of the face, each of us comes to recognize each other in one way or another. So I will pause for just a moment, and then I will begin the history of the masks. Shelby? There we are. I know that each of you was given a handout, which was provided, but this is a very nice PowerPoint presentation, which I think will be advantageous to all of us. When I began my research, I found that masks are over 3,500 years old. But I thought, what better place to start the research on masks than with ancient Greek and Roman masks? And as you look at the images before you, I want you to notice something that is true for all of them, with the exception perhaps of the fifth from the left. Please notice the large mouth. The eye holes are very round. And there does not seem to be any other type of expression, except look at the one that is second from the left with the horns and the eyebrows. Look how angry he looks. So I guess when I was doing my research and finding out about how interesting and necessary eyebrows are, that plays out. Ancient Greek and Roman masks, as pictured here, are made of stone. But these are not the original masks. The Roman masks and the Greek masks were used primarily for theater and were worn generally by men. Now, at the time, they were made of linen, which was dipped in an adhesive. They could also be made of leather. They were worn during the theater presentations, the comedies and the tragedies that the Greeks and Romans were so well known for. And they were so innovative and so far-sighted that they realized that the masks that they used in their plays would not last and stand for all time. So what they did, they carved the images from the masks into stone so that they would be preserved for time. The very first image on the left is a statue, a Roman statue of a woman holding a mask that would have been used in one of their plays. And as you study each one of them, you can imagine that the person that was wearing the mask during the play needed to have a very large mouth opening because the plays were generally outside. They needed to be able to project their voice through the opening. And really no other part of their face would have been visible except for the eyes. But the mask was the predominant feature of the Greek and Roman plays. They normally wore tunics, but the rest of their body covering was not the primary focus of the play. The play was the facial recognition, the masks that they wore to convey the meanings that they wanted for their plays. I don't have any further information on any of the particular characters that are pictured here. I was particularly interested in the man with the horns. I tried to do research. I thought perhaps that he was Bacchus, but I could never find any images of Bacchus with horns. So I am completely wrong on that. I wonder if any of you watching might happen to know who that particular god might be. And if you do know, I would be very interested in having you let me know. I guess not. Well, it will remain a mystery. I'm going to click to the next images, if I may. As the caption says, these are the African and the tribal masks. And I found in the research that many of the people from Europe looked down upon the African and the tribal masks. They considered themselves to be very very primitive because they were carved of wood as the third image. Generally, they represented deities because their masks were used in worship, also in funerals, to call the gods, to thank their gods. If you look at the second image, it is a wooden mask that is carved, and the teeth are made of bone, and the hair around it is a type of straw that would be found probably in Africa. The one on the far right, again, is a wooden mask. I think it's absolutely beautiful with the feathers. Think of the birds that must have been in the area where that mask was carved. The beautiful blues and the beautiful greens. And the masks of Africa and the tribal masks, as I said, were often used to call to their gods, to thank their gods. If there was a drought, there might be a celebration in honor of the god, particularly, let's say, the god of rain, to call upon him or to call upon her to grace the land with the necessary water so the crops would grow. The mask on the left, I find extremely interesting, again, with the exaggerated mouth and the very colorful mask. This comes from another area in Africa, and each of the different masks that you see on your screen is also from another part of Africa, depending upon what raw materials they had to make their masks. And as I said, the Europeans, even though they did not really have the opportunity to see a lot of masks from Africa, their masks were considered to be less superior than the Europeans. A sad testament to the way culture still seems to be, that we look down on others who are different than we are, who do not worship in the same way, who do not have the same traditions, the same language. Even back then, those discriminatory practices were very evident. And I found that in my research, and I thought, have we not come farther than that? I hope so. If you look at the mask that has the bird beak and the bird feathers, this mask is a mask that could have been worn. All of these images, in fact, are of masks that would have been worn by the wearer, by the person of the time, rather than the wearer, I should say. But I wondered, how did they affix them to their head? They do not have sticks where they would be handheld, but they were actually worn. So they must have been able to fashion a rope piece around the back of the head and to wear their masks. Not everyone in the African tribe or even in the Native American culture would have worn masks. These would have been worn by the priests, the shamans, the elite. Ordinary people, as I consider myself to be ordinary, would not have had the opportunity to wear these masks. I'm going to slip to the next. I'll let you look at these Asian masks for just a bit. When I cropped these images, they are images from Thailand, China, Japan, and Laos, or Laos if you prefer. The dragon images in the Asian culture are most important. Now during Chinese New Year's, people don a mask and an entire costume of a dragon and parade through the streets, both in China and also in New York City and Chinatown, not in the time of COVID, of course. But the dragon is a very, very important image. It is one of their primary deities. Again, that word deity keeps coming up in all of the cultures. Those in the Asian countries fashioned masks about 3,500 years ago. My research showed that the masks that they fashioned were the most ancient of all. And I want you to notice the contrast between the African masks and the Asian masks. The African used the raw materials that they had in Africa, less color, more feathers, more wood, whereas these masks depict human faces, particularly the one on the left. It looks to be a woman. I'm not sure that it is, but I do believe it is a woman. Her eye sockets are showing. Her nose and her mouth are fashioned inside the mask. And she appears to have a sun disk on her head, the image of light, and that's an image of hope. If you look at the mask in the center of the screen, he has a yellow face, and it appears that he has a mustache and a crown of some nature. Notice his eyebrows. Does he look angry? Does he look something like the image of the Roman god from the first PowerPoint pictures? And I want you to notice the mask with the green face. He is ceramic. he would have been worn only for a short period of time during the dances or during the festival, because that mask I can see would be very heavy, as is the one below that. I want you to notice the blue face. Look at his teeth. His eyes are staring at you. He's very fearful looking. He is a deity. Perhaps he is someone who represents death. Do you notice the skulls on the top of his head? Symbolic of death. And then above the skulls, there's other ornamentation. As I did a little bit of further research on that particular type of mask, it depicts death and rising again. So even in the Asian culture, though they are not of the Christian faith, they still have the same beliefs that you and I have, that we live a life. If we are good, we are accepted. We go to heaven when we die. If we are not a good person, what happens to our soul, to our spirit? This image of this mask depicts resurrection. The skull portrays the death, and then above, that person rising again. I was very curious about the mask on the far right of the screen as I look at it, of the dragon. He looks very fierce. He has the horns. Only the eyes of the wearer are able to be perceived. The person wearing that mask would have had a costume to accompany it, so as to portray ferocity. All of these images, with the exception of the woman on the left, seem to me to be very frightening. They're not comforting. They are beautiful. Some are carved. Some are made of clay. The one appears to be a person wearing a dragon head with fur. I would imagine that is a modern mask, because you can note the fur around the eyes and you can note the fur around the chin. So perhaps that mask has been worn or would be worn during Chinese New Year's. All of these masks, each one of them, has their own story. Each one of them portrays an image of a person who is calling upon someone, whether you call him God, Yahweh. Naturally, they wouldn't call him Yahweh in the Asian countries, I understand that. But each one of them is portraying a deity, hoping that there is something beyond what is here on earth. Hoping that by wearing a mask, the people who are here on earth can connect with their gods, can speak to them in a way that their gods will hear them. I am attempting to go to the next PowerPoint. Carnival. The masks that you see in front of you are masks from Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, and also the Venetian Carnival masks. Very interestingly, the word carnival comes from the Italian carnevale, carne meaning meat, vale, the absence of or to go away from. And so carnival, as we call it in the United States, is a celebration before a time when no meat is eaten. The carnival in Brazil begins in February, depending on when Easter might be. The carnival in Venice begins about the same time. And we here in the United States celebrate Mardi Gras, the time before Lent, when some religions give up meat in atonement for our sins, if you will, in preparation for Easter. If you look at these carnival masks, the one at the top left, along the cheeks, notice the harlequin. The harlequin was a character that was very popular during the Venetian carnival. Carnival gave people from all classes an opportunity to walk among the other classes and not be recognized because of the mask that they were wearing. So a poor person could save up money for a very long time and purchase or make a mask for the carnival. The harlequin was a person who really was very, very poor. He or she would take patches of fabric in the diamond shape and stitch it together and make a costume. And then the mask would also have that same harlequin image on it. And when that person was celebrating in the streets of Venice or even in the streets of Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, no one would know their status because of the masks that they wore. The other representations are of Venetian masks. The one in the center with the beautiful white face, that white face is called Bauta, from the Italian. And she, I believe it is a woman, although I could not say for sure, it appears to be a woman. She's wearing flowers, a ruffled collar, and she would be in full costume. Perhaps it is a man, though. We really can't tell, because what is behind the mask? That is the mystery. The mask that I'm wearing is a Mardi Gras mask made from 3 separate colors. My mask has the gold, which is the sign of power. As in many cultures, gold is power. The green is a sign of faith, represented on my mask. And if you go to Giant Eagle or Tops or any of the grocery stores, or perhaps you make your own king cake. A king cake is a round cake, which is usually made during the time before Lent, eaten on Shrove Tuesday, the Tuesday before Ash Wednesday. And on that king cake are the colors of Mardi Gras. As I said, gold for power, green for faith, and the purple is for justice. Now, none of the masks that are portrayed on the PowerPoint are exactly like mine. The one looks very similar with the very, very beautiful peacock plumes. And I imagine that that is a modern mask rather than one that is much older. Notice the beautiful blues, the greens, the golds. Notice the pearls. Imagine in the 13th or 14th century, some nobleman or noblewoman wearing that mask. Imagine getting the peacock feathers, not from Michaels or A.C. Moore in the craft section, but actually having a peacock available that you could pluck the feathers and use that in your mask. Imagine that those pearls on there are not paste or fake, but that you have enough money to actually adorn your mask with real pearls. And perhaps the gold on there could have been gold leaf. You all know the wealth that was Venice, a trading capital, a shipping capital, many, many wealthy people living in Venice. And at the time of Carnival, many people from all over Italy would come to the Venetian Carnival. I like to think that perhaps the poorest of the poor might have been taken out of their low class that one special time in the year, and they could walk among the gentry, unseen for what they really were. They were just stained by the upper classes, unseen. But for that one time in Carnival, they became part of the general population. I don't know if you're familiar with the term Scaramouche, but the mask in the bottom right, it's blue and it looks like a bird's beak. That is a mask that would have been worn. Scaramouche is the fool, a person who was considered to be foolish, ill-mannered, not accepted. I wonder if some nobleman or noblewoman might have worn that mask to be of a different class, just for one brief moment of time, not to have to put on the airs of their aristocracy, but just to become part of the ordinary citizenry. Scaramouche. Maybe you've seen that very, very old movie. I believe it was in the early 40s, and Leslie Howard portrayed someone called Scaramouche. And he was a foolish person. And the story goes that he was in love with some woman and he didn't know how to act. He was tongue-tied around her. He was a Scaramouche. And his friend came with him and told him what to say to this lovely lady. And in the end, his own personality won out and love conquered all, and the fool was accepted for the gentleman and gentleman that he really was. Please stop me if I'm talking too much or if you have any questions. I'll go on. Day of the Dead, Dia de los Muertos, in Mexico. And only in Mexico, not in the other Latin American countries, but this is specific to Mexico. As you look at these masks, each one of them is an image of a skull. Dia de los Muertos is November 1st. Some of us call it All Saints Day. It is the day in the Mexican culture when the families go to the cemeteries. They take food, they take chairs, candles, they attend to the graves. They sit as a family and talk to their loved ones who have passed away. Not everyone who participates in Dia de los Muertos would wear one of these masks, but these are representative of the culture. This past year, I did not go into a lot of stores, but I did notice when I did go in that these images, these skull images for the Day of the Dead mask, they were everywhere. I saw masks, I saw images of masks. I've seen mouse pads that were in the fashion of these skull masks. Please notice how beautiful they are. They can be very frightening, particularly that pink one with the teeth showing and the yellow one below. But notice not the ugliness or the fearfulness of them, but notice their beauty. I don't think it is improper to say that those in the Mexican culture love color. Each of these masks is so colorful. Even that pink one. Notice the yellow one again, as I said below, showing the teeth, definitely a skull, but notice the adornment around the eyes of that. It's painted. The forehead has a beautiful flower. There are flowers on the crown of the head. As we look at each of them, notice how important flowers are in the Mexican culture. Look to the left of your screen, the very first one. That person seems to be smiling. Even though it's a skull, I don't think it's nearly as frightening as those on the right. She's happy. Whoever would be wearing this mask would be joyful. Sad because their relative or their loved one has passed, but joyful to know that they will be reunited one day. The second mask, with the beautiful coronet of flowers. Notice the use of black. Black seems to be a very dark color. When we think of black, we think of funerals. We think nighttime. Some people are afraid of the dark. Some people are afraid of death. They equate death with darkness. But in the Mexican culture, death is not darkness, death is light. You can see by the masks, they celebrate one's life. They remember what the person was like when they were here on earth. Yes, they're missed. They're thought of every day. Just as we think of those in our own families and friends who have died. I think it's a very interesting way that the Mexican culture remembers those who have passed. They remember it with celebration. They remember it with dancing and music. A picnic in the cemetery that day. Early on, when cemeteries were first begun in the United States, they were very small and they were next to a church. And it wasn't until much later in the early 19th century that the cemetery movement began, where many of the bodies that were in the cemeteries of the churches were moved to a larger cemetery. Think of our cemetery here in Erie, incorporated in 1851. People used to take picnics to the cemetery. Now we go to the cemetery usually on Memorial Day and take care of the graves. We take flowers. We talk about those who have passed. Maybe we wash their tombstone. We cry. But in the early cemetery movement, people saw that as a joyous place, a place of meeting, where they would sit and come and sit and have picnics, have celebrations. When is the last time that you went to the cemetery and took a picnic basket? When is the last time that you wore a mask to the cemetery? This cultural curiosity, if I may use the term, bespeaks the fact that the people in Mexico view death and regard it, and also regard the life of those that they loved, perhaps in a different way than some of us in the United States do. They don't see it as an obligation that they have to go and clean the graves and put flowers on, but that they are given the opportunity to go and visit with their loved ones. And they wear their masks and they sing their songs. There are musicians and bands who go to the cemetery for the Day of the Dead, Dia de los Muertos. Mesoamerican masks. When I researched this, I had a very difficult time selecting the mask that I would show you. These masks are indicative of so many variant cultures. The Aztec, the Inca, the Olmec, the Toltec, and all of the other indigenous people of the Americas, South America, Central America. Now, as you look at these masks, you can see that these are made of pottery. The one on the far left is a modern interpretation of an older mask. Originally, that headpiece, that coronet, would have been made of feathers, beautiful feathers from the birds of the rainforest. This mask is reminiscent of one from Guatemala. I want you to notice that the large ears are truly large ears. The people of this one particular culture did ear piercing and ear stretching. Nowadays, it's popular for some people to tattoo their bodies, to stretch their ears, to put earplugs in. That is not a modern invention or a modern habit, but the people that lived in this Mesoamerican region also shaped their ears, and you can see that, and we can learn about that practice by looking at one of their beautiful masks. The blue mask. Notice the headpiece. The headpiece on that mask shows a pyramid. And that pyramid is being held, if you look very closely at it, by a god. The pyramid is on his lap. He is rather in a laying down position. You can see his head is facing left and he has a beautiful headpiece on. If you look to the right of the pyramid is another god, Quetzalcoatl, the plumed serpent. Look at the beautiful plumes coming from the top of that headpiece there. This mask would have been worn by, again, the priest class. The eyes are visible. He would have been able to speak because the mouth there's an opening on the mouth. There are two deities, one over the left and one over the right ear. This would have been a ceremonial mask, perhaps worn at a funeral, perhaps worn when they were asking Quetzalcoatl to bring rain, to bring sunshine, to help their crops to grow. The priest class in Mesoamerica was very strong. They had their rulers and they had the priests. And the priests were very powerful, mostly men. I have not found any research that shows that any women were in the priest class in this particular culture. If you look at the gold mask, he has his eyes closed, almost as if he is sleeping. He has a ring through his nose, and he has a mouth plate to cover. There again are the earplugs. This mask is made of pure gold. This mask is in a museum. It was stolen by the Spanish in the conquest of Central America. We're very lucky that we still have this mask. Lucky that it wasn't melted down and shipped to Spain. I wonder why the maker shows this image with the eyes closed. Is he asleep? I doubt it. When I looked at this mask, I thought, I wonder if this is a death mask. I don't believe that it is. I believe that this would have been worn again by a chief or a priest for a certain ceremony. The ceremonies that they wore these masks for were not ceremonies of marriage or coming of age. They were saved for special occasions to ask the gods to favor them. If you look below, that mask is primarily made of jade. It would not have been worn. It would have been displayed. Very, very heavy jade. Notice the eyes are made, the center pupils are made of obsidian. And it's very difficult to see, but there is a bird image sitting on the forehead. The bird has one eye and he is looking to the right. And then the pink color at the top of the mask is two birds facing one another. And again, notice the ears, very huge. The culture had earplugs. Very interesting. I wonder why they did that. Why do people today tattoo themselves? Why do they elongate their ears? Why do they have multiple piercings? Body art, body transformation. I'm sure that you have heard of the elongated skulls in the South American culture. None of these images portray an elongated skull, but I'm thinking that any type of body modification was imitating someone that they had seen or something that they had heard about from the ancient ones, stories that were passed down from generation to generation. Many of these cultures did not have a written language. The stories that they had were oral, told from one generation to the next. It was the job of the priests to teach the people. It was the job of the chiefs to teach the people. And just as today, it is the job of the parents to teach the children about the culture. And what a wonderful, wonderful display of Mesoamerican culture we see in these masks. The last mask on the right is representative of a feather mask. This is done in pottery, copied from an original, which is in a museum. And there are blue and green and gray feathers on the top of the mask. Notice the scroll work, kind of above the eyebrows, if I may say eyebrows. And then the blue next to the face. signifying the ears. Again, very large earlobes. And then on the side, there would have been feathers hanging down. They used materials that they had around them. Feathers, straw, obsidian, jade, gold. When the Spanish came, their culture was all but destroyed. Destroyed in the name of a European culture, which again felt that the native peoples in Mesoamerica and also in our United States of America were less important, that their culture was somehow backward. The Europeans felt that their way, their beliefs, their religion was the only true religion, culture, way. Thank goodness none of these images were obliterated, smashed, destroyed, thrown in a lake, thrown in the water. We know that the gold was melted down. Montezuma met the Spanish. The Spanish were going to decimate his village. He asked, please, keep my people safe. He was ransomed. His weight in gold was demanded by the Spanish. The native people gave him all they had in gold so that they would spare their leader. And in the end, Montezuma was murdered in the name of a European way of life, which they felt was more important, more perfect. But as you look at these masks, look how sophisticated they were. Look how knowledgeable they were. Their artwork, their metalwork, their stonework. Could we do that today without the use of modern equipment? Without the use of laser? Without the use of diamond cut? I doubt it. How did they fashion these masks? Who were these men and perhaps women who fashioned these masks? Look at them closely. What are they saying to us? They're saying, remember me. I'm important. I matter. I'm made of stone, but I represent so much more. Cherish me. Look at me. When I included this part of the presentation, I was hoping that most of you had finished your tea, your sandwiches, your scones, and your desserts, because this is rather, dare I say, a morbid part of the presentation. I'm going to save the plague mask for just a bit. The two images on the left are images of a plague doctor. Let's look at the picture in the center. If you remember from the Venetian mask, that's a representation of the Scaramouche. That one would have probably been worn during the Venetian Carnival. That mask has the large eye holes, but the rest of the face is covered. You wouldn't know who was behind that mask. The eyebrows are covered. Remember what I said earlier about the psychologist telling me that the eyebrows were the most recognizable facial feature? As I look at this Scaramouche, I don't think of a fool. I look at the beautiful detailing. Is that silver on there? I wonder. It's a beautiful bird's beak. Those of you that were lucky enough when the King Tut exhibit came to Chicago, or perhaps you've been lucky enough to travel to Egypt to see the King Tut exhibit there, will recognize the next as King Tut's death mask. And to the right, Abraham Lincoln's death mask. I'll talk just a bit about death masks. As you know, the death mask of King Tut was not the mask that you think of in the normal sense of a mask. It was put over his body to cover his face and his shoulders to honor him in death. It was never worn as a mask. King Tut was already in the next world when that beautiful mask was placed in his sarcophagus. Abraham Lincoln, on the other hand, had a life mask crafted when he was still alive. What the artist would do, they would take pieces of gauze and dip them in a solution and lay it across the face of the living person. And then that was to protect the skin. And then plaster was put over that portion and let to dry. And that was called a life mask. Abraham Lincoln had 2 life masks of himself made, and he commented that it was very hard for him to breathe. You can only imagine the artist who was doing the life mask having to leave the nostrils open so that the person having their life masks done could actually breathe. But this is Lincoln's death mask. Many important people, Elizabeth I, who was Henry VIII's daughter, Dante had a death mask. If you have read Dan Brown's book, The Inferno, if you've seen the Inferno, the movie, you know that the main character, Robert Langdon, goes into the cathedral where Dante's mask is found in that font. Dante actually does have a death mask, and it is on display in Florence. Abraham Lincoln's death mask is on display in the Hall of Masks at the Smithsonian Institute. So if the COVID breaks in a year or 2, you might be able to go and see those at the Smithsonian, in Egypt, in Florence. Traveling, once again, something to look forward to. Let us turn now to the plague images. The plague, the Black Death, the pestilence. Between 75 and 200 million people died during the bubonic plague. It peaked between the years 1347 and 1351. Many people during that time, the 14th century, believed that the plague was sent by God because of their sins. They didn't know how to atone for what they had done, but they knew that they were getting sick, and they believed in their hearts that they had done something wrong. Think of the Bible, think of the plagues, think of Moses, God's wrath upon the people of the earth for wrongs. But during the 14th century, there were doctors, there were alchemists who understood that the plague perhaps was not God's vengeance upon the people of the earth, but perhaps it was caused by something. They did not know about bacteria. They did not know about viruses, but some understood that it was caused by an external factor. And the external factor that caused the plague were fleas. Now, if anyone is at all squeamish, I'm going to warn you that this portion of my presentation is not the most pleasant, but it needs to be discussed. And we can count ourselves lucky in the 21st century that this virus that we have is not dealt with in the manner that this plague was dealt with. These images portray a plague doctor. He was a man, again, not a woman, a man who went among the diseased, not really to try and help them or minister to them in the way a doctor does now, but to investigate, to see if they could figure out what was causing such death. Think of the sanitary conditions in the 14th century. The cities were crowded. There was human and animal excrement everywhere. People did not have the luxury of a bath or brushing their teeth. Sanitary conditions were non-existent. Those who were very wealthy, who lived in palazios or villas, or who had a home somewhere out in the country, were able to leave the city and thereby perhaps isolate themselves. Well, that sounds familiar. To stay away from the contagion. These plague doctors were not doctors like we think of nowadays, who have been to medical school, who have taken advanced courses in immunology and other sciences. They were the dregs of society. They were people who wanted to be doctors, perhaps had studied medicine a little bit, but most probably were not too successful. They were the ones who were brave or foolish enough to be willing to go into the cities, into where the plague was most concentrated. They believed that the plague was spread by miasma, by the air, by vapors. And so they understood that they had to guard themselves against this miasma. So the coat that the plague doctors wore was made of a heavy fabric coated in suet. Yes, I said suet, like maybe your grandmothers used to render in the pan before she made the roast beef on Sunday dinner, coated in suet. And then they wore a leather coat over that. They wore pants, or pantaloons as they were called in those days, also made of leather. Leather shoes to cover. They wore gloves, gauntlets made of leather. The hat signified that they were a doctor. Very high esteem, very highly regarded, very intelligent, someone to be looked up to, someone who might have the answers. The plague mask. And aren't we glad that we are not required to wear that type of mask on a daily basis? The plague mask, again, was made of leather. It had a bird's beak fashioned so that there was a space inside where the plague doctor could put aromatic herbs, such as lavender, marigold, any of the flowers that were of the region. Some of the plague doctors even put sage inside their beak, and they lit it so that it was burning. Can you imagine? They were breathing in Lavender would be all right. Marigold would be all right. But burning sage, he's breathing that in. He also wore goggles to protect his eyes. They didn't want the miasma, the vapors, to penetrate anywhere on their body. The beak, though, had holes in it to allow for breathing, of course. And many of the plague doctors became very, very sick because they breathed in the very thing that they feared the most, the miasma. They attempted to do a good job. They did the best they could in the 14th century. I want to talk a little bit about what the plague actually looked like on the body. And if anyone is squeamish, I'm going to ask you, turn your volume down. The plague produced boils on the body, large boils, pus-filled boils. Do you see that stick that the plague doctor is carrying? He would often go into the home where the person was who had the plague, and he would beat the person with that stick, hoping to beat the plague out of them. The plague stick had a point on the end, and very often the plague doctor would take the pointy end of that stick and stick it into one of the boils and lance it, and all of that matter would come oozing out of the boils. Imagine dealing with that. Imagine the odor. Imagine how fearful having a doctor like that come into your home to take care of you. This is a person who is supposed to do good. He's frightening looking. He's frightening to me, and I'm just looking at a picture of him. Another method that the doctors used in those days, and also really up until after the Civil War, was something called cupping. They would have a glass cup that looked rather like an egg cup, which would be superheated. And then they would put that over the boils, hoping to relieve the pressure. So not only did the person have the boil from the plague, now they had a burn mark around it from the cupping. They also used bloodletting, where they would slit the wrists and other parts of the body to let the blood out, because they believed that the disease, the contagion, was in the blood. And if you relieved the blood, the disease would flow out. They also used leeches. They carried them with them, and they would put the leeches on the boils, and the leeches would suck out the infection. None of those methods were effective. Sadly, many people died, as I said. Between 75 and 200 million people died of the plague. And it wasn't the first time the plague had been on Earth, but the first time it was really recorded.
Liz, I just want to give you a time check. It is 4:12.
I am going to finish up in just a second. Thank you. I appreciate it. I think I will just allow you to think about the plague. Feel grateful. What we deal with on a daily basis is not what those people dealt with on a daily basis. And finally, to end on a high note, Miscellaneous masks, Halloween masks, masks that our children wear for Halloween to disguise, to be someone else. Masks can be gruesome. Masks can be sweet. They can be of animals. Look at that beautiful Egyptian mask. That's a modern mask. I thought I put that in here because I thought it was absolutely lovely. These are the masks that we're most familiar with. Plastic, feathers. All masks are disguises. They help us to be someone that we are not, someone that we wish that we could be, someone that we hope we never will be. In closing, I would like to quote from Oscar Wilde. Man is least himself when he talks in his own person. Give him a mask, and he or she will tell you the truth. Nothing is more real than the masks we make to show each other who we really are. Thank you for your attention. I appreciate it.